involved in child welfare, it's so important that the system provide that we become more and more involved in including communities that historically have been marginalized, oppressed, et cetera, et cetera. And that we need to move beyond the work as usual and really embrace diversity informed practice. That's a new word that I've heard recently, diversity informed practice. And it's really important. It's critical, as mentioned in the brief invitation, it's critical for child welfare to focus on equity throughout the continuum, from prevention of abuse and neglect to permanency and achievement and post-permanency interventions. And we have various panelists here who will be talking about different areas of their expertise. And I, to begin, I'm from Southern California. Well, really, I'm from Mexico, but I'm raised in Southern California, leading Latino Family Institute, founder and executive director, or CEO. I still can't get used to the CEO part. And I also teach graduate students at Cal State Long Beach, and hello to my Cal State Long Beach friends that are on as well. So welcome and looking forward to this discussion. So I want to open it up to just introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about you.
Thank you, thank you. My name is Womasetta Jones, and I serve as the Secretary of the Rhode Island Executive Office of Health and Human Services. And within the Executive Office of Health and Human Services, the departments underneath our portfolio would be Department of Human Services, Department of Children, Youth, and Families, Behavioral Health, Developmental Disabilities and Hospitals, Veteran Services, Office of Healthy Aging, as well as we are the single state authority for administering Medicaid. So that falls within my portfolio here in Rhode Island. I've been in Rhode Island for the last 2 years. Prior to that, for 6 years, I was very fortunate to work in Minnesota, Ramsey County, and serve as their social services director. And prior to that, the first 25 years of my career, as I date myself, was in Illinois, where I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, educated in Illinois. And I worked for the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, started as a direct line worker and worked my way up to deputy chief for the state. And as my last role in Illinois as a deputy chief for the state for child protection, as well as being social services director in Rhode Island, and also sitting here as secretary. For each of those roles, I was the first person of color to serve. So I take that very seriously, and I'll always let that be my lens and my focal point, because my guiding principles are choice, the utilization of a racial equity lens at all times, as we also do full and meaningful engagement with community. So the bulk of my background is in child welfare, but it stretches across all social services and human services departments.
Welcome, thank you.
Go next. I'm Camila Bunn. I'm the CEO of the Adoption Exchange Association, which is soon going to be the National Adoption Association. Really excited to be here on this panel. Racial justice and dismantling racism in our structures and systems is just truly important to me in the work that I do with my 500 members across the country. We've been examining how racial inequities and implicit bias is showing up in the work that we do as permanency providing organizations and child serving organizations, and not only examining it from analyzing our data and disaggregating our data to look at who's really ending up in a better outcome with permanency, but also examining it from a structural lens as well. What can we do in terms of our workforce? How can we ensure that our workforce is not only diverse, but also inclusive at elevating leaders of color to positions of power and influence? So really excited to be here and share a little bit about what we've been doing with our membership across the country.
Thank you, Camila.
Hi, I'm Ramona Burton. I work for the federal government. I am a senior policy analyst. I have focused for the past few years on child welfare issues, including a study looking at substance affected infants, trauma informed care, unaccompanied minors. I am also a mother to a 19-year-old who was adopted from state care. She moved into our home when she was 13, and we adopted her at age 14. And as I said, she's now 19 years old, and she is a college student who is thriving and just is the light of my life. So, yeah. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this now.
Thank you. It's wonderful to have a diverse life experiences, both personally and professionally. We see a lot of our people that work in the field that have also adopted, and they're some way also personally involved. And even in my case, if I didn't adopt, but the fact that I too grew up in South Central LA, and that's really where I start. And that's what I tell my staff as well as my students. First day of class at seminar, I always tell my students, we need to start where we talk about that we start as a social work value, we start where the client is. But you know what? Even before the client, we start where we're at. And that is why we need to take accountability and look at ourselves and have the courage to explore and process, because we all have things, like my mother always says, everyone has the tail that can get stepped on. And because of that, and I'm not saying that the tail is bad, it's just, it's there. It's a reality. Whether people want to acknowledge it or not, it is there. And because of that, we have to recognize that there's no such thing as colorblind society. And I talk about Latinos and, growing up in California, and, for years and years, it was the sleeping giant. It was the sleeping giant, which, well, let me tell you, that giant woke up decades ago. Thing is, people don't want to acknowledge it. So I'm really excited, and to have our agency being the first Latino private adoption and foster care agency in the state of California and Western United States. So that is a big responsibility that we continue to carry. And I just finished the semester at Cal State Long Beach about 2 weeks ago, and reading my students' in reports. One of them just kind of, they all hit me, but one of them in particular, and she said, "Professor, one of the biggest things that I learned this semester in seminar, through the reflection, through the wheel of positionality, and all the new things that we're now doing with our social work students, is," she says, "I realized that every client is me. I am the client." And that to me was like, yes, she got it. She got it. And I think, that's a challenge. If we can all see the people that we serve, the communities, the individuals, the organizations as me, regardless of race, class, gender, whatever, I think we would have a much, much positive experience. And I think that's what we're moving forward to. That's what we're moving forward to. So the first question I have here is, how has this work changed over the years? Now that we're talking about diversity, inclusion, how has it changed for each one of you, or whoever wants to share and ask?
I think for me, how has it changed over the years depends on how you look at what that year was. But I think, what I saw in the work itself is more people talking or using the phrases best practice. Using certain terms like metrics and outcome measures. So I saw a much more academic, linear, analytical approach that at times I think has been just as much as of a disadvantage as an advantage. Because much of that was also developed and came forth from, let's say, white academics, white think tanks, white this, white that. So as a result, so much was whitewashed and not really looking at reality. Our child welfare system is significantly, egregiously, in my opinion, disproportionately made up of families of color and poor families. And many of those who do this research and look at that don't really have that frame of reference. Doesn't mean that I'm saying that they're racist or that they're not aware of reality, but you know, you always hear that phrase of, I don't see color. Yes, you do. You see color, because if you can't see color, what do you see? But I think what I've just seen through the years in the evolution of the assessments and the focus groups and the research, that at times it's created more of a disadvantage than an advantage. And we need to get back in touch with what realities really are when our involuntary systems are disproportionately made up of families of color, and our voluntary systems are disproportionately not made up of families of color. And I should say the same as to who also work in those workforces. They're not a reflection of the communities they serve or don't serve, which all plays into it. And we got so deep into, you need to have an MSW, you need to have a BSW, you need to have this, that, and the other. Some of the best social workers I know didn't have a degree. They were from the real world, and they did better work than many of us with all of these degrees. So I think that we put too much emphasis on research and studies as well as credentials and gotten away from people.
Thank you. And you know, the way I kind of see it, it's sort of like, you know, needing to recognize and respect non-dominant bodies of knowledge. So that if there's so many different ways that we can get information. It's not, academia is one way, absolutely, and I totally agree with it. But like you said, who are we including in these focus groups? And it needs to be moved beyond mainstream. And I think we're moving towards that. And then the other thing that you said about the different words, you know, trauma informed or whatever form informed we use, what does that mean specifically to each community? What does it mean to me? And a lot of times it may be mainstreamed, defined, and being able to now feel part of that working definition to challenge it.
May I add to that, Maria?
Yes.
Just want to add that, you know, I think it comes down to how this structure was created. Who was it created to serve? Who created the measurements that we're using? And what are they actually looking at? And are the folks who are actually applying those measurements, are they doing it in a way that is non-biased? So I think all of these questions really need to be asked. So when you think about what has changed, in my view, not much has changed. We continue to see a disproportionate representation of Black African-American children, Latinx youth, Native and Indigenous populations in the child welfare system. And I would venture to say the reason why we continue to see this historically is because we haven't done the deeper work of looking at the structures. How is this system actually designed? We can put many programs in place, but if we're not looking at the root cause of the issues, if we're not examining the systems and looking at how they're designed and who are they designed for example, you know, many of us have heard of best practices around recruiting families of color. And I believe that's extremely important. We need to be doing that work. But if the families can't get through the process to get a home study done and be identified for a child, then how are we actually improving the outcomes that we want to see?
Absolutely.
So in terms of how the work has changed over the years, I guess one thing, I'm going to take a sort of different perspective and mention the Family First Prevention Services Act. Over the last few years, we've seen, I think the last maybe 2 years, we saw passage of the Family First Prevention Services Act. And I know the intent, at least, of that act is to ensure that fewer children are placed in group homes and languishing group homes, and that more children are placed with families, and that there's supposed to be more work around prevention and trying to keep families together rather than placing children in safe care. And so I think that I don't know how that will play out, but I think the intent is right. The idea that trying to keep children with their families, trying to see what services can be provided to families to support them so that the children can be kept safe and at home is the right thing. And I also think having fewer children in group homes. I mean, we know that Black and brown children have disproportionately been placed in group homes. And we also know that the research suggests that group homes, that's not where children should be, that children fare much better when they're in a family setting. So I think the Family First Prevention Services Act, it holds great potential. I guess what remains is how it will be implemented and how it will play out state by state.
Absolutely. The next question I have for you here is, what do you see as the most important change that needs to be made in regards to your perspectives? What are some changes? I know, Camilla, you've talked about workforce. Ramona, you talk about policy, and also statewide.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the workforce needs to reflect, I think Wamesetta said it earlier, needs to reflect the communities from which we serve. And we need to really have, and I think you also mentioned this too, Maria, you know, the empathy piece about really looking at this work when you're becoming a social worker. I think there needs to be a different, you need to come at this work from a different value system or a different mindset to say, you know, I'm not here necessarily to fix it. I'm here to facilitate and support. We've been talking a lot at the association about adoption. So we're, you know, the National Adoption Association, about adoption being addition, not subtraction. So I think that when you're talking about what needs to change, I think it's truly the values, where we are in terms of our values. What is our strategy? Because I think from values, then you go into strategy, right? So we all have to kind of think, okay, what are our values? You know, are we looking at this from the standpoint of, you know, the birth family and fictive kin and reaching out to those communities from which the children came and really embracing them and having that empathy to understand that, you know, the families should come first, right? Families first, if families should come first. So to what extent can we, when we're talking about an adoption, be about shared parenting, be about, you know, really extending that who loves the youth. You know, our youth should not have divided loyalties in an adoption scenario. We should be looking for opportunities where we can have shared parenting. So I think we have to start with the values. We have to start with really valuing and understanding and empathizing with the families, all the families that are coming forward who really care about the youth that we all serve.
Yeah, and I think what I would add too is we need to be honest with ourselves. Systems, let's say government, because I'm government, you know, we need to be honest with ourselves about what our ultimate objectives really are. What are we really trying to accomplish? And being honest about that, because if you look at your current policies and procedures, what they may illustrate is that, first of all, these policies and procedures were written by individuals who are not the ones whose families are most touched by these systems. And as such, when they were written on what was best for government, not what really was perhaps best for strengthening and supporting families, and as such, building up communities and leading to strong states. So first, systems such as government needs to just be very honest with themselves and look at how they want to really proceed based upon that ultimate objective. If it is what I hope, which is to strengthen and support families and to keep families together and or create a lifelong family for a young person, we need to also get about doing internal work to really address racism, microaggressions, implicit, explicit bias, because before you can authentically engage community, you need to really know what you really are. So we have to do a lot of internal work in that way too. And all of this work is concurrent, all happening at the same time, not when one finished the other, but doing that internal work as it relates to race and impact is what helps you get to that ultimate piece of what is your ultimate objective, if you're aware of those true biases and biases. And, you know, and then just looking at, again, for me, I'm all about everybody should have choice. We should always be using a racial equity lens with everything that we're doing. And that's from policy creation to hiring practices. But then you need to also get to authentically and meaningfully engaging communities, all communities, not the dominant community, meaning who has the power. So really looking at that so you can build and design that system based on what your ultimate objective really is. And that's where I always try to keep taking the work back to, is what's really what is your ultimate objective? I don't want to read any more cute mission vision statements, because are they real? So I think that goes in alignment with, what we're talking about today.
Yes. And Ramona, I'm not sure if you want to add any comments.
Yes, I again, I guess on two different levels, in terms of important changes. On one level, I'm going to speak to the idea of a living wage. So I think it's important to focus on a living wage. Too often when we talk about policy and actually talk about changing a living wage or providing a living wage, it's like, oh, $15 in 2024. But really, the needs are more pressing and more immediate. And I think that with COVID, and we saw how people, like a week after COVID and being laid off of a job, people didn't have food. They were standing in lines to get food. So that's evident. That's evidence right there that a living wage is needed. And to tie this to child welfare, we know that many children, they end up in care because of neglect. And neglect, in some instances, stems from poverty, because the mom has to go to work and doesn't have childcare for the child, and therefore the child is left alone, and thus there's neglect and so forth. And so the idea of a living wage, I think, could help. It could help all families, and especially Black and Brown families. So that's one point I want to make. And then secondly, I want to come back to this issue of trauma-informed care, because I feel like there's a need for trauma-informed care to be in place across agencies, across the continuum of services that are provided to families. So not just with child welfare, but in juvenile justice, in housing and education, because children are showing up with trauma. And, we've heard often to not ask what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And I think that's so true. I mean, having become aware of trauma-informed care and the effects of trauma, I've had conversations with my daughter, I've had conversations with my husband, I've reflected on my own history, and I see how trauma shows up on a day-to-day basis in terms of how I personally interact with people. And so I feel like to the extent that we train our workforce on trauma-informed care, so that when they're providing services, they acknowledge that children have experienced trauma, that parents have experienced trauma, that social workers are experiencing secondary trauma, that is very important, and that will help us provide or help professionals provide care with a greater level and a different level of sensitivity. And again, particularly coming to Black and Brown families, acknowledging some of the challenges that Black and Brown families face and how that affects them on a day-to-day basis. I feel like that's important. And I don't want to take up too much time, but I want to mention that in the course of doing some research, I visited a child welfare office in Wisconsin, and they had adopted a trauma-informed approach. And in doing so, they no longer had plexiglass separating the person at the front desk from the family. They saw that as trauma-informed and how they were separating themselves physically from the family. They no longer just showed up at a family's house unannounced. They began to call a family ahead of time to say, I'm coming to visit with you, to show that level of respect I mean, many of us, we want people to call in advance before knocking on our door. And so they implemented that as a show of respect and acknowledgement of the humanity of everyone who's involved in the process. So I'm just sort of going back to what some of the other panelists said, that it's really a comprehensive approach, and it comes down to such basic things as plexiglass and how you decorate the office and so forth, and how you interface with your clients. So thank you.
Yes, and so I'm just thinking about what you were saying about not just showing up unannounced. And what is that? That's really a paradigm shift, right? Because we're the authority, we're the professionals, and we're going to do what we're going to do. And how can that foster positive, trusting relationships? And what you were mentioning regarding, it's not about why are you doing what you're doing, but what's happened to you, and really also embracing neuroscience. And that's what you're talking about, trauma-informed practice. And now that we're talking about diversity-informed practice. So what is that? What would that look like if we really are committed to diversity-informed practice? What would that look like? What do we need to do?
I'm not familiar with this new term of diversity-informed practice, which then gets me a little nervous. I think I keep things simple for me, as it relates to when I think back when they talked about culturally competent practice. Mm-hmm. It turns out that, that didn't mean what somebody may have thought it once meant. I believe before you can start to do diversity, inclusion, and equity work, like I said, you first have to start internal to your organization with doing real work on an individual basis. Now, some people, they don't know what they don't know that they don't know it. Mm-hmm. And some people know up front they are racist, but you need people to actually engage in that process internally. And so they do it as individuals, then they do it as team. And it starts from the top down, by the way, not just bottom up. It's not just going this way or that way. It's got to go both. But I guess my illustration on Zoom is about, for me, it's about first you got to do the internal work before you can even begin to know and or see where you are truly lacking in the ability to be practicing in a way that is respectful and honest to everybody. So I think about the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. That may be what you should be striving to within your organization, is that. Because some people are never going to change. And if you work in government, by the way, I can't just fire a person because they are racist. I have to have enough to show, and it's got to be a buildup of enough. So I guess I'm not as familiar with that this piece of that, but I think I try to keep things simple and use real words and call it out without just going to necessarily those catchphrases. So that would be, what I would say is you got to start inside before you can get outside. And then you need to infuse it within all, not, from hiring to practices to all of it. You have to drill it down.
Yes, and just to
sorry, Maria.
No, not at all. No. And just to give credit, it's the information that I've gotten is from the tenants, diversity-informed tenants for working with infants, children, and families. And let me just read their definition. Diversity-informed practice recognizes the historic and contemporary systems of oppression that shape interactions between individuals, organizations, and systems of care. Diversity-informed practice seeks the highest possible standard of equity, inclusivity, and justice in all spheres of practice, teaching and training, research, writing, public policy and advocacy, and direct service. So this is awesome. This is great. And hopefully more and more people will refer to this and get to learn more about it, and be able to name what it is that we're doing. And it kind of also reminds me of some of the stuff that I've been talking about for years in regards to like what Camilla was saying, that it's not just about just changing the language, and as well, Juanetta, you were also mentioning, but it's not just the literal translation. And that's what's happened. And that's what I've seen, and things are getting better, but it's not just the literal translation. Oh, now we're going to do this diversity. or now we're going to do trauma. And all we're doing is just adding a word or two that we're going to be calling it. Now it's inclusive, but that curriculum wasn't set up with our communities in mind. So is it truly inclusive? Is it truly culturally relevant? So I always talk about, that it needs to not just be a literal, it cannot be a literal translation. It needs to be a cultural translation. Because if that doesn't happen, then it's not gonna hit anything. And like my mother, she'll sit there and say, yes, 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 I understand. And I know darn well she didn't get it, but she's not gonna tell you because it's disrespectful. She's gonna say, okay, yes, okay, fine. And then later she'll say, okay, what did he say? So how many families, how many people we work with that are in the same kind of situation? How many staff people do we work with that also, those cultural things that are impacting? And not that I'm saying in a negative way, but sometimes cultural, there's the systemic barriers that everybody can say, oh, yes, yes, yes. The organizational barriers, yes, yes, yes. But there's also culturally based barriers. And I'm not saying it in a negative way. And I'll just give you one quick example. I too work in adoptions, and the stigma for many people, the stigma of infertility has kept a lot of people from looking towards adoption, because that stigma, and that can be a cultural, religious example. And that's sort of like some of the things that I've talked about throughout the years, that we also have to be mindful of that and not get passive cooperation, because we don't want passive cooperation. It'll look good on the numbers and the accreditation, checking boxes, but we want active participation that's going to integrate into our systems, our communities, and the people that we serve, and those of us that serve. So another question that I have here is, from your perspective, what is the biggest barrier for the system to overcome with regards to race and cultural equity, inclusion, and value?
I think the biggest challenge that we're finding right now is disproportionality, right? And it's the lack of folks really being serious about taking a look and disaggregating their data and then saying, and then what, right? So often we have data around, who's coming into care, what are their outcomes, who's leaving care, but we really have to look to see what are the experiences of African-American youth, what are the experiences of our Native youth, what are the experiences of our Latino youth, what are the experiences of the families that are also coming forward and inquiring about becoming foster resource parents or adoptive parents? What are their experiences like? And to what extent are we finding one another? What extent are we connecting the dots? Also, let's look at our workforce. Where are there ceilings or barriers to our workers being able to ascend into positions of power and influence, so that the policies and practices can be reflective of the communities from which we serve? We truly have to take a look, follow our data. And you asked earlier about how do we really do this? I think we start with that. We have to start with the data. We have to really be eager to take a look at our information and then say, and then what? And then I think, data is the strongest mechanism we have, to really take a look. No one can debate it, right? If we look at our data and we say, okay, here's what's happening in our system, now what? That's where the real work begins. So we have to start with the data.
And that reminds me of Dr. Terry Cross's work in regards to, when he talks about the history of the ICWA. How did that come about? Because of data, because they knew all the thousands and thousands of children that were taken away from their families and sent to these boarding homes. And we know what happened to those children. And it had to take ICWA, it had to become a federal law. And even still to this day, people continue to fight and to not want that to be supporting the community that has been practically decimated for centuries. And it also kind of reminds me of the other federal law, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, MIPA and IEPA. And we know that that was another, it still continues. And we know that there's wanting some changes to the revision, because MIPA is not acknowledging the importance of race and culture, that we're not even allowed to talk about it really, or to have trainings for people who are interested in doing transracial adoptions or trans ethnic adoptions. And I know that there's this move to sort of kind of rework the law. So those are also.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I would add to in terms of workforce too is, let us not forget the importance of building supports. It is, many of meetings that I've been in for many of years, I have often been either the only person of color in that room, or the first person of color in that role. And I want to just reference even the two that I previously left, where I was the first person of color, they have since not put another person of color. So where I'm going with this though too is, it's very lonely space. As you begin to diversify the workforce, it's lonely. And also you often feel unsafe. I may come off like I got the utmost confidence in the world, but my stomach at times be churning because, I'm like, what's going to happen after it gets out that I just said what I said? How is it going to be misconstrued? Will I be supported? So I want to just say, we have to make sure that we build in those boxes when we look at that visual demographic of having equity. You need to put solid materials in those boxes to help that individual be supported, be protected, but also to allow that individual to continue to grow. And so when you look at recruitment, you have to have a solid retention plan and a solid plan for promotion and opportunity that's always centric and rooted to support, and always centric and rooted to the fact that racism exists, explicit and explicit, biases are there, microaggressions are there, and this person is going to face so much, and they should not be asked to provide proof that they've experienced a microaggression, but just how all do you support? And also the influence and impact that it has on supporting and strengthening the families, having a reflection of themselves at each role in, in an organization. So I think that that's something we have to make sure that we build towards and for, because it is very scary and can be very lonely for people of color in organizations as they are put into roles that they are always looked at and targeted and subjected to so much. So I just want to stress that we have to do that for the workforce.
Yes, and I always say that if I could win the lotto, my dream would be, and I know we've been talking a lot about adoption, but in general, just child welfare in all the spheres of child welfare, prevention, intervention, mental health, all the different areas. It's educating our community, providing that psychoeducation, especially for families who haven't been, didn't have the privilege, aren't privileged, they're marginalized, et cetera, or they come from other countries like my parents, immigrants, and like many people, immigrants, that to them, sometimes things are a foreign concept. They have no clue. That's another example of a cultural barrier. So I have this, dream of having a family center, a huge building with a family center, so that people could come to us. Oh, your child was detained by the department, come to us. Your child has special developmental delays, come to us. Your child has special medical, whatever the situation is, substance use, mental health, come to our center, and we will provide you the information that you need to know what are your rights, what are the rights of your child, what does the law say about it, and how can you advocate? Who are the people and community and organizations that can help you? And imagine if we had a place like this. And I think there are many places throughout the country. I will say that there are, but we're all in silos. And I think that's also another part of the barrier, that we all work in silos. I think now more and more people are becoming more aware of the importance of us working together as a multidisciplinary team. And that, I think, is another thing that is important for us to kind of challenge ourselves. And it's no longer just the county worker and the regional center, but all of us together working for the benefit of the child. And like you guys have been saying, really taking it on a personal level. Like my student said, I am the client. I realize I am the client. So if I am the client, then go for it. How can I make it better?
People who really have that, I mean, first of all, Maria, build that center and do it. I say, do it. And I just, yeah, when you begin to think of yourself as, if you see a mirror, right?
Mhm.
You'll practice differently.
Mhm.
You will have more empathy. You will bring it to a personal level. You'll reconsider, if you're a CPS worker, if you're an adoption worker, and you have to transport a child to a new place. Would I leave my child there? Would I want to leave there? Would I want to be here? Would I want to be there? What would I want in this scenario? Would I want to know where my siblings are? Would I want to know where my auntie is? I mean, all these things, the children are us. We are the children. We need to truly think about it that way. We can't create barriers where they don't need to exist, right? And to Wameseta's point about safety, it's an analogy I think about too, is, the safety that I'll speak for myself as a Black professional in this work, and the loneliness, yes, that you experience, and the safety. But then I think about our children who are in care, who might be in a home that is not recognizing and honoring who they are and their cultural identity, and how unsafe they must feel. As we all have seen the police brutality and everything happening all around them, and maybe not knowing, where that family that they're with is on the spectrum of understanding what's happening in the world. And whether it's an African American child, Latino child, perhaps losing their language in a particular family, things have to change, and I think they begin with ourselves, really recognizing that we are the children, and what would we want, and what do we want for our youth.
Very good. I believe it by heart. And I see that Selena is now joining us.
Yes, hello. Thank you all so much for everything you shared so far. I wanted to make sure we could have a little time for some audience Q&A as we start to wrap up. So one of the questions that I have for you all, and anyone can feel free to answer this question, is what advice do you have for the individuals that are joining in to listen to this call, whether they are parents or professionals in the field, but what advice do you have for people? So now that we have all this information, this context, what can we do to make a more culturally and racially just system? As individuals, what can we do? How can we take action?
The first thing I say quickly, without hesitation, is unite. Unite. There is strength in a united voice. It doesn't mean that everybody in that group will agree on each point. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying when you unite, it's exactly everybody has the same thoughts. But what I'm saying is when you bring together your voices and you put them in one place and you work in tandem, you will be surprised at how much you can accomplish, because that voice is loud and mighty. But I also want to say in the same breath, if that can't happen, never stop using your own singular voice and be relentless in it, and be focused, be strategic, and be honest and speak your truths. So, don't stop, even if it can't be all come together. You have to do this. You have to do that. Because I can tell you, sitting in my seat, it's definitely without a doubt, some of those loudest voices are the ones that get the most attention. Or it may be loud for a moment, but then it goes away. Nope, be consistently loud, but be strategic, be thorough, be thoughtful, be transparent, be honest, be all of these things. Because you also don't want it to be where, because you're not focused, it loses momentum, because it's like, we can't even follow it. So I just want to use your voice. But if you can come together, that makes it even better.
And I would say surround yourself by a strong, robust relational support system. we know that a good prognosis for anyone, including us, is the quality of your relational health. And that's so important, especially when we are being challenged, is that we also need to take care of ourselves and not to be afraid. And even at my age, I still get, I get nervous. That's just the reality. My staff knows I've been going nuts since a couple of days ago, but that's just who I am. And I am who I am. And some people like my style, some don't, but I own it. And to me, it's like, I'm okay because I know I've got people behind me, because the work is not easy. That's for sure.
I just want to go back to something that Womazetta said earlier, in terms of educating oneself. I think that it's incumbent upon each of us to educate ourselves, and there are a lot of resources out there today, especially in the wake of what happened with George Floyd, his death, his murder. There are resources out there, there are books, there's online training, and educate oneself, because I mean, that's where the change begins, right, with oneself, and understand what implicit bias is, and then question your own biases. When you catch yourself making assumptions about someone, a family, a child, question that assumption. Where is that assumption coming from? And then lastly, and this is something that was said in terms of speaking up, I think it's very important. I'll use the word integrity, but having integrity and speaking up. I've noticed that as I read in the newspaper, as I read about horrible situations, whether it's child welfare or police departments or elsewhere, it seems like it always comes back to integrity, and people not voicing a concern, not speaking up, and when you don't do that, it allows these situations to fester and to continue.
Thank you. Camila, did you want to add anything?
Just to echo, I mean, I think what Ramona said is right on about educating yourself. And just one other point about being a mission-driven leader. I've done some talks on that with other professionals at the association, really carving out what your mission is around this work and being a mission-driven leader, not letting yourself go off on a path or go down a direction that is not going to keep you focused on your mission. I think it's just very important that you translate your mission for yourself, and being a mission-driven leader. And leaders are at all levels. So you're leading yourself, and just draw out that mission and stay focused on it.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's great advice. So another question is that data shows that male youth of color have a harder time getting help. And so is there, I know we talked about diversifying the field and bringing more people in, but are any of you aware of any movements or any work or organizing or initiatives to get more men of color into the profession? Or any suggestions on what could be done?
There are a couple of organizations, and I might be able to put some websites in the chat in a moment, that are working on this issue, that are bringing together Black social workers. Of course, there's NABSW, but there's another group starting out of Atlanta that's been really looking at this issue as well. It is very, very important, again, for the mirrors that we have, African-American men being able to be in our workforce to support our young brothers who are in the child welfare system and absolutely can benefit from the mirrors that would provide. So definitely encourage, and I'll put the information into the chat of a couple of organizations that are working on this issue.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Camila, for those resources, the guidance. Okay. Does anyone have any advice for hiring staff who were previously children in out-of-home services or at risk of it? Any advice or any thoughts or experience?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised that there's many people that come in, and whether they haven't been in the system, but they may have been in other systems, including my own family. So I'm not surprised. But the thing is that, you know, depending on the level of trust that you have with your supervisees or your fellow coworkers, they may not share. They may not feel that they're able to share. But if they do, then I think it's really important for us to be very supportive, extra supportive, and at the same time, you know, really checking in, you know, the importance of reflective supervision, which is another thing that's really been out, and it's really important. It's not therapy. We're not providing individual psychotherapy, but it's really helping them to continue to process. How are you feeling about this? What can be a potential trigger for you? And then focus it on, I'm going to work with you as it relates to the client in terms of what comes up for you as it relates to your role as a social worker. Now, the other stuff that comes up for you as it relates to your own stuff, that is, we can identify and say, and that's things that I would love for you to go and, you know, work out with your individual psychotherapy. Because that I think is so important. And that's another thing. It's such a taboo. People don't want to say they're in counseling, or people don't want to go, oh, I'm the professional. No, it's really important that we all take ownership. Again, my mom says that tail, everybody got the tail. So we got to find a way to smooth it out, because it ain't going to go away. And the way you can smooth out that tail is to talking with friends, therapy, whatever it is that you can do to social emotionally regulate, to physically motor regulate, pharmaceutically regulate. And so that eventually you can self-regulate and kind of break those barriers. But you have to develop a level of trust. If not, they're not going to tell you. And then things will happen and you're not going to know why is she reacting this way? Or why is he reacting this way?
Yes.
You know, when I look at the question about the hiring, what advice do we have for hiring staff who previously were in out-of-home placement services or at risk? Now, again, I work in government, and we do have, requirements in terms of minimum qualifications, education, and so on. Now, one piece, without a doubt, we need to work on changing much of what's in many of the hiring regulations and requirements for many jobs in state government, because we know that the civil service system, exam, and all of that was created by those who are not Black and brown, and by those who were not parts of those systems. So we do have to work on looking at what are the qualifications to be able to do some of the work that needs to be done. But what I want to say to anyone is, don't you ever be ashamed of being a child or a young adult who may have been in out-of-home placement or at risk of it. Don't ever be ashamed of that. Don't let anybody make you be ashamed of anything. Just like I tell people of color in general, don't you ever be ashamed of being Black and brown. Truly wear it with so much pride. I take the most pride in the fact that my skin is brown. So I say that to our kids, don't be ashamed of it. Don't not be proud of it. Look at how you can, networking and finding people and resources to help you is critical and key. And networking is something that especially our children, as well as Black and brown children in general, don't know how to do, because we didn't grow up with access. Okay, we didn't grow up with a rich uncle or an uncle or a daddy who was governor or all of those things. So with that, I want to say, try to learn and get into spaces to learn that. And I want to say to the professionals on this call, shame on you if you're not stepping up to be a mentor to someone, many someones. Do not say you're too busy or you don't have time. You need to step up and be that mentor. And we teach, how do you network? How do you get access? How do you do it? So we need to step up, those of us in this professional world, and be a mentor to children who have been in the system, as well as to all children who come from poor families and Black and brown families, because and just step up and do that, because that's the only way to truly get more access. So that would be my advice for all of us.
And as we wrap up, I just wanted to thank you all so much for joining us. To our facilitator, Maria, and our panelists, Ramona, Camila, Wamazetta, thank you all so much for sharing your experiences and your opinions. and your profession with us so vulnerably and openly. I know everyone has gotten so much out of this experience, and we really, really appreciate your insights and taking the time out of your day to share with us. And to thank you to all of our attendees for taking the time to join us today and asking your questions and engaging in the conversation. So from everyone at the Center for Advanced Practice at Adoption Rhode Island, thank you all so, so very much. And we hope to see you all soon.
Thank you. And may the discussion continue and our ongoing self-reflection. Thank you to all.
Absolutely.